Hi Year 12s, welcome to the second video in our nervous system PowerPoint for homeostasis. Last time we talked about the nervous system in general. This time we're going to be looking at just neurons, the nerve cells that are responsible for controlling the nervous system. So let's begin. Remembering if you need to know the need to know from this topic, that was in video 1, not going to be in this video here. So, first off, a neuron. Yes, you are going to have to be able to draw a neuron. So here is a nice diagram here, and we're going to talk about the different parts. So first off, the cell body itself, which is also called the soma. Cell body is this part in here, and it basically contains the nucleus, the cytoplasm, the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, the ribosomes, Golgi body, lysosomes. Basically all the organelles of the neuron can be found inside the cell body just here. So coming off of the cell body, you have this nice thin, long, fibrous cord here, this blue line here. That's called the axon. And like I said before, that's a long length of fiber that carries nerve impulses from the cell body to the axon terminals of the cell. On top of the axon, you have these light blue circles here, which we're going to call the myelin sheath. And basically, they're a layer of insulation around the axon that helps to increase the speed that the nerve impulse will travel along it. At the very end, we have the axon terminals, which are small branches of the axon that form the connection, or the synapse, which we'll talk about in another slide coming up, with other neurons in the nervous system. It's at this point in the axon terminal that your nerve impulses turn from an electrical signal into a chemical signal. Lastly, we have the dendrites, which are over here attached to the cell body, which are extensions from the cell body, and they're going to receive the chemical signals that are sent out from an adjacent neuron's axon terminals. Their job again is to convert it back from the chemical signal back into an electrical signal to travel down the axon again. There are 3 different types of neuron that you need to know about. First off, neuron. The whole point of a neuron, which is just a nerve cell, is it's responsible for transmitting those nerve impulses around the body between the sensory organs, central nervous system, and the effectors. There's 3 different types of neurons. We have a sensory neuron, which is number C here. We have an interneuron, B here, and a motor neuron over here. The sensory neuron over here, its whole purpose is to carry nerve impulses from the sense organs and sensory receptors to the central nervous system. Whereas our interneuron over here, it's going to transmit impulses around the central nervous system. It can only relay them over short distances or between sensory and motor neurons when you're looking at a reflex arc. We'll talk about that afterwards. The motor neuron over here, lastly, carries your nerve impulse from the central nervous system to the effector glands, muscles, or organs. It is important that you can recognize these. So you maybe give them a test and say which one is a motor neuron, which one's an interneuron, which one's a sensory neuron. You may be asked to draw one of them. They all have the same things, your dendrites, your cell bodies, your axons, your axon terminals. It's just they're in different locations. So motor neuron's usually the standard one we draw, but you could be asked to draw any of those 3. Nerve pathways. So a nerve impulse, when it's carried to the central nervous system, it's done so via a nerve. So it comes from the sensory organ to the central nervous system via what we call a nerve. All a nerve is many nerve fibers basically inside a protective sheath. Now those nerve fibers themselves are just a bundle of axons from sensory and motor neurons. And there are a whole lot of other associated cells that we need. So this whole thing here, this is a nerve. Inside there, we have a nerve fiber, and inside the nerve fiber, lots of little axons from motor and sensory neurons. What about responding to a stimulus, though? So obviously, we've got these nerves. How do they work? So it all starts with your sensory receptors, which are specialized cells that are going to detect changes in either the internal or the external environment, maybe both, that our organism is exposed to. Sensory receptors usually are only sensitive to one type of stimulus, and they can be found inside sensory organs. So, for example, I have sensory receptors called photoreceptors inside my eye, and the eye is a sensory organ. Okay, I have mechanoreceptors inside my skin. They're going to sense different feeling, etc., and the skin is the sense organ. Once that sensory organ or the sensory receptor detects a stimulus, it triggers what we call the stimulus response model. And that works through a sensory receptor detecting a stimulus, a sensory neuron transmitting that stimulus's message via a nerve impulse to the central nervous system, the central nervous system processing that information and coordinating a response, that response being sent via motor neurons to the effectors, and the effectors then carrying out the desired response to that stimulus. So an example of that is, for example, you're out on the oval, main oval, and you see the light reflecting off of a moving football coming right towards you. You're not going to be able to catch it. The sensory receptors, the photoreceptors in your eyes, are stimulated by that light, and they carry a nerve impulse along your sensory neurons to the central nervous system. Your brain interprets, we're going to be hit by this football, which coordinates a response to that visual stimulus. Your central nervous system then sends a nerve impulse along a chain of motor neurons to the muscles in your arm or legs, and the person's going to use those muscles in their arm or legs to move out of the way of the moving ball. Okay, so that's a stimulus response model. But there's also... we're going to talk about synapses first. So all a synapse is this space here, or also known as the synaptic cleft. It's the other term we use. Both terms need to be used as year 12, synapse or synaptic cleft. A synapse is just the gap, basically, between two neurons. So we've got one neuron here, another neuron here. The nerve impulses are transmitted as chemical signals called neurotransmitters across that synaptic cleft. We're looking at that in more detail. So the nerve impulse will travel along an axon until it arrives at the axon terminals of that neuron. Because it's the first cell that it's traveling for, we call it the pre-synapse cell. So this is messages going before it's reached the synaptic cleft. The message reaches the axon terminals of that presynaptic cell, and it reaches the neurotransmitters, which are packaged into vesicles. The arrival of that nerve impulse causes a process called exocytosis, which we've looked at in cells, to push the neurotransmitters outside of the presynaptic cell into the synaptic cleft. Those neurotransmitters then will diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bond with receptors that are on the postsynaptic membrane. Now, each neurotransmitter has its own unique receptor, so it'll only bond with that receptor. When it bonds with that receptor, it sends a nerve impulse down the next axon. So that's how neurotransmitters work, and how we can't have electrical signals traveling just through those synaptic clefts. And we'll talk about the reason for that in class in detail. Reflex response, though. So this is what I was trying to allude to before. A reflex response is an involuntary response to a stimulus that has not been coordinated by the brain. So something is happening and you need an instantaneous response. Even those few seconds that it would take for your central nervous system to process the information has to be skipped for the time being. So a reflex arc allows that organism to respond rapidly to the stimulus without having to process the information. It will process it afterwards once everything's happened, but it's not going to process it at that exact moment because it needs an immediate response. So an example of that. You're walking around the kitchen and you don't realize that your gas stove is on. Okay, and as you're just talking on the phone, for example, so we're over there talking on the phone, and you rest your hand on the flame, and you don't realize you're resting your hand on the flame. Instantly, heat is the stimulus that's detected in the sensory receptors, the thermoreceptors inside of your skin. A nerve impulse is transmitted along a sensory neuron to your spinal cord. It realizes this is a very important piece of information, and it's transmitted to an interneuron in the spinal cord. And that nerve impulse is then straight responded from the interneuron straight to a motor neuron. So there's no going to the central nervous system's control center of the brain. It's gone straight from a sensory to an interneuron to a motor neuron. That then sends a message to your effectors, which are your muscles, move that hand away. In that instance, you're not even feeling pain. You're just moving your hand. Once you've actually moved your hand away, your body's got time to recognize what's happened, and then you'll start to feel the pain of that burn. But the initial response of your body was to get your hand out of that harm because it was going to cause damage to your receptors. But what is the role of the reflex response? Well, basically it helps serve a range of vital functions, including automatically adjusting to change the environment, reducing and avoiding damage, maintaining posture and balance, finding food and mate, escaping predators. Reflex response is basically responsible for our survival, evolution, natural survival of the fittest.
That's all, folks.